So, but one of the themes also was, is the resurrection a literal biological fact, or is it a spiritual experience that the apostles had, a psychological experience of some kind? How can it be explained? Why was this so important to the early Christian proclamation? And so their conclusions were more along the lines of a psychological phenomenon that inspired the apostles to go out on mission, and that there really was no, that Jesus didn't leave the tomb either in an embodied way or in some kind of mysterious disembodied way. So, Brother David Steindl-Rast, who is my really talk about history, my historic spiritual father, going back to at least 1970,
Wow.
a Benedictine monk. He's 100 years old now. An amazing person. I guess his birthday will be in July, but I like to say, round it out, he's almost 100 years old. And he was my spiritual inspiration and guide in those undergraduate years. And we've stayed in touch. I actually served as his assistant, lived with him in a hermitage for 2 years in Connecticut. And then we've always stayed in touch. I think we gave an interesting program on the rainbow body back in the early 2000s at Esalen Institute in California, all right, among other things. And so he said to me, Francis, I've been in dialogue with Marcus Borg about the resurrection. And what we really would like to have is some kind of scientific or anthropological evidence for the reality of the resurrection, that this is a human possibility, okay, even beyond any theological questions, but that it really is something built in to the human person in a way that science has maybe begun to explore or not yet begun to explore. And he said that he felt that the Shroud of Turin was a credible piece of evidence in the inquiry about the reality of the resurrection. And of course, as you probably know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of articles about the shroud, some of very good quality, scientifically speaking, others of somewhat poorer quality, but attempts have been made to study that particular mysterious relic with all kinds of technological approaches and have come up with very strongly persuasive evidence that that really is the burial cloth of Jesus. That it has a very subtle image of the front and back of a man. It was as if it was folded at the head and then folded over the front and the back, and then that man was put in a tomb, right? And at some point, one estimate is within 36 hours, that man dissolved into light, an explosion, as one person put it, an explosion or a burst of conscious light that had such an intensity of energetic power that it could burn the upper fibrils of the linen cloth that was used for that shroud, and leaving this mysterious image, which then, when subjected to scientific study and different kinds of lenses and cameras and computer simulation and whatnot, actually looks like not a print from a body. Like if you put paint on somebody's body but it looks more like a projection of light onto a surface. Good to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, wonderful. I read your book, The Rainbow Body and Resurrection, and also on the life of Milarepa, and found them both extremely interesting. So I just was very, very pleased that you've agreed to come on and speak with us today.
Sure, I'm glad to do that. Of course, anything that encourages, knowledge of this book is great. I mean, it's 10 years, and a lot of people have, sent me emails appreciating that book. So a lot of work went into it.
Well,
So,
it's obvious, and it's such a different perspective because we think of the resurrection as one thing happening, in one part of the world, and rainbow bodies happening in another part of the world, and two separate religions and two different things. So it kind of exploring this in this conversation will be very interesting and see how we come to it. So when Christianity speaks of resurrection, what is actually being transformed?
Okay, so there are actually two things to talk about with resurrection, and interestingly enough, people seem to forget the two. Obviously, the first one being Jesus's own resurrection on that early Sunday morning after his crucifixion, right? And in fact, I was just reading Evagrius of Pontus saying, quite explicitly that this was something that he did himself, right? That he rose from the dead on his own power, which is fourth century, reading of the event, because some places in Scripture talk about him being raised from the dead in the passive sense,
Hmm.
that God did it. But of course, God did it in the divine Word who was present in Christ. Then there's the resurrection of everybody. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the book by a fellow named Frank Tipton, I think his name is, who was a professor of physics at Tulane University in New Orleans, who wrote a book called the Physics of Immortality.
Hmm.
And in that book, he goes into a whole mathematical and cybernetic interpretation of the universal resurrection, which is kind of an interesting approach. But it shows that even in science, there can be an intertwining between religious inquiry and scientific curiosity. But the point being that everyone is going to rise from the dead. And of course, Christians believe that, Muslims believe that, and many Jews believe that as well. So it's a two-part event, but it's always divided up between Jesus, of course, and then the final resurrection at the end of time, with a few exceptions in between, like the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, okay, and Elijah in the Old Testament and Enoch in the Old Testament. So, but they're not. We don't talk about resurrection of Elijah or the resurrection of Enoch. All right, we do recognize, of course, Mary's Assumption is a kind of uh, fulfillment of her spiritual journey in a form that is similar to what her son experienced in the resurrection. But it does mean, of course, that the entire person rises from the dead. Okay, that's what's crucial here, and can manifest in different ways, and even a long way into the future. Okay.
Why is it that we don't speak about the resurrection with Enoch in the same way as Christ, for example?
The text, in Genesis is so brief.
Hmm.
It just says sort of he walked with God, and then later on in Jewish apocalyptic literature, like just a century or so before Jesus, we have the books of Enoch, which are preserved, as you probably know, in the Ethiopian Bible. And in some old Slavonic translations as well. And those books take the figure of Enoch and expand on that one little verse, right? And really go into a journey through the cosmos
Hmm.
with the person Enoch as a kind of spiritual guide. It was very interesting how that one verse gave rise to actually four apocryphal books in the Bible. So it's an important fragment of Jewish heritage that got understood as why. Why? Because at the time just before Jesus, a lot of Jewish people were expecting not only the arrival of the Messiah, but the arrival of the end of the world, because things look just so bad. And I think, a lot of people today would almost feel the same way, that there's a tendency to look at history through the lens of, oh my God, it couldn't get worse than this, right? And so naturally, a body of literature emerges from those sentiments and those religious aspirations. Right. So it's a little different, though. Especially, I find it interesting that, you almost have Enoch as a kind of space traveler, right? And remember that he's the one of the early figures in the Bible who, I think he's the father of Melchizedek, if I'm not mistaken. Excuse me, not Melchizedek. Methuselah. Methuselah lives in 969 years, the longest lifespan in the Bible, and Enoch only gets 365 years,
Exactly.
right? Which rings a bell with the number of days in the year, 360 plus five, for the old way of doing a calendar. So there's a kind of a hint of cosmic knowledge and energy in that name and in that figure. So it's a very interesting world to explore more deeply, and some people indeed have done so in recent years.
And when we speak of Jesus's resurrection, I mean, we're talking about that biologically, not just metaphorically or metaphysically, or is it metaphysical biological? How would you kind of classify that?
Yeah. All right. So this is really getting to the heart of the inspiration of our research, because Brother David had been in discussion with the people on the Jesus seminar, and in particular Marcus Borg, who's a distinguished New Testament scholar. And the consensus of the Jesus seminar people, who are basically secular scholars doing research on the New Testament, and among other things, they're famous for having established criteria for which sayings of Jesus that we find in the Gospels are likely to be authentic and which are likely to have been transformed down through the years after the death on the cross. Okay. So, but one of the themes also was, is the resurrection a literal biological fact, or is it a spiritual experience that the apostles had, a psychological experience of some kind? How can it be explained? Why was this so important to the early Christian proclamation? And so their conclusions were more along the lines of a psychological phenomenon that inspired the apostles to go out on mission, and that there really was no, that Jesus didn't leave the tomb either in an embodied way or in some kind of mysterious disembodied way. So Brother David Steindl-Rast, who is my um, really talk about history, my historic spiritual father, going back to at least 1970,
Wow.
the Benedictine monk. He's 100 years old now, and so he said to me, Francis, I've been in dialogue with Marcus Borg about the resurrection, and what we really would like to have is some kind of scientific or anthropological evidence for the reality of the resurrection, that this is a human possibility, okay, even beyond any theological questions, but that it really is something built in to the human person in a way that science has maybe begun to explore or not yet begun to explore. And he said that he felt that the Shroud of Turin was a credible piece of evidence in the inquiry about the reality of the resurrection. And of course, as you probably know, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of articles about the shroud, some of very good quality, scientifically speaking, others of somewhat poorer quality, but attempts have been made to study that particular mysterious relic with all kinds of technological approaches, and have come up with very strongly persuasive evidence that that really is the burial cloth of Jesus. And it has a very subtle image of the front and back of a man. It was as if it was folded at the head and then folded over the front and the back, and then that man was put in a tomb, right? And at some point, one estimate is within 36 hours, that man dissolved into light, an explosion, as one person put it, an explosion or a burst of conscious light that had such an intensity of energetic power that it could burn the upper fibrils of the linen cloth that was used for that shroud, and leaving this mysterious image, which then, when subjected to scientific study and different kinds of lenses and cameras and computer simulation and whatnot, actually looks like not a print from a body. Like if you put paint on somebody's body but it looks more like a projection of light onto a surface. Okay. So that's pretty amazing. And so their brother David was more and more persuaded that this was a real document that, oh, he said, but then he said, now, what do we know about human beings and light? And he said, well, my friend Vanja Palmers in Switzerland just told me that his Tibetan friend, Dr. Chitsegang, who was a psychiatrist in Zurich, who was from Eastern Tibet, told him that recently someone died in Eastern Tibet named Khenpo Ache, and after he died, his body completely disappeared. and that there were remarkable phenomena of light and other paranormal phenomena around the time of his death. So Brother David said to me, if we get a little bit of a seed grant from Vanja, you should go and lay out the groundwork of this of some research, to go there, interview the eyewitnesses, because we were less than 2 years away from the event. So I got some seed money, went to Tibet, began setting things up, and then organized the presence of a friend of mine as a very good translator of Tibetan. I speak a little Tibetan. My friend speaks much better Tibetan. We got a team together and we went there in the year 2000. So literally 2 years after the event. The event took place in probably early August of 1998. We were there in July of 2000. All right. And we were able to interview a number of eyewitnesses in the spot where this took place. All right, so this is probably the first time that anyone, whether a theologian or an anthropologist or maybe a mixture of both, actually interviewed eyewitnesses to something along these lines. There are accounts of rainbow body manifestations, for example, in the writings of Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche, the well-known, now deceased Tibetan Dzogchen teacher who was teaching here in Italy for many years and throughout the world. And there are other accounts in historical documents and so on. But this was the first time someone actually interviewed people. And I'm happy to say that after me, at least one Tibetan master took his disciples and did the same thing, interviewed people to try to get the facts the same way we did. And he reported on what we had done and that he admired the work that we had done and that he wanted to replicate it, which is very scientific.
That's
You know, the idea of actually replicating an experiment by through an interview process in this case. So that's where we're going. So what we discovered, of course, that such a thing is highly likely. I mean, there's a certain plausibility and credibility to the high quality accounts that we were given by eyewitnesses, persons of some reputation, persons of considerable spiritual experience in their lives, people who had known the Kenpo very, very well. And that was we did a follow-up the following year in northern India to interview two younger monks who were also eyewitnesses. So we have at least 5 eyewitness accounts in the book.
that's amazing. That's the bridge between Catholicism and Dzogchen and these two, Christ and Che. Che, is that how you pronounce it?
And achu,
Achu,
achu, meaning the practice of ah. All right,
right?
the sound of ah as your main practice. That's what his name means.
But while we're here in this at this early stage of the conversation, I'd still like to get some more groundwork on Catholicism. And you mentioned Enoch, and I'm wondering if there are others over time who have also been resurrected, similar to the way Christ was. And when they're back in their human form, are they the same or transformed into a different elevated being?
Hmm. All right. Well, all right, let's think about that a little bit. Of course, let's take as a prime example the Blessed Virgin Mary, who is believed by Catholicism to be fully ascended into heaven in body and soul. All
Mm,
right. And so we also take note of the fact that in proclaiming the Assumption of Mary to be a belief, a dogma of the Catholic Church, Pope Pius XII, back in 1950, also very discreetly pointed out that Mary, he doesn't refer to her as having died.
mm,
Because according to the really ancient traditions of the church, and going back to the rabbinic interpretations as well, um, death for the human species entered the world with the fall of Adam and Eve. Okay. So bodily death is seen as an aberration.
mm,
It's not normal. All
mm,
right. It's a consequence of original sin. So, since Mary, in her Immaculate Conception, that is when she herself was conceived through the union of Saint Joachim and Saint Anna, and she was a little child, she was born normally, and she was conceived normally, but she was protected from the transmission of original sin from the first moment of her existence, right? So she's the Immaculate Conception, which doesn't mean the virginal conception. A lot of people get that confused, right? She's the Immaculate Conception, that is, she is without the stain, macula in Latin, right? The stain of original sin doesn't reach her. So she doesn't have to die. Right? That's the whole point there. So when she breathes her last, all right, according to the legend of the Assumption, she is placed in a tomb, and there are all these actually mystical appearances of flowers that come raining down, which is very similar to Genpo Acha. Okay, some of that is quite similar. And then she is taken up into heaven, all right, body and soul, where she then can join her son Jesus, in a very special relationship with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Blessed Trinity. Okay, so this is the way we understand Mary. But as you know, there have been many apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and many different appearances, with different characteristics. For example, there was an apparition of the Virgin Mary only 12 kilometers from here in that direction, and she appeared around 1887 to a young shepherd girl named Bibiana, and she was showing herself in blue and red robes, showing the body of Christ immediately after he was taken down from the cross. All right, so this is the Pietà, the mother present at the descent from the cross of her son, the Redeemer of the world, and she's presenting him with her hands outstretched in a prayerful, almost priestly gesture, offering him to God. Okay, and she didn't say anything, but almost within weeks of that apparition, other people came, experienced the apparition, and were healed of various diseases. So this is the kind of thing that happens. But no one would say that if you touched the apparition, you would feel anything solid. All right, so it was luminous. Okay.
Mm.
And I think Fatima, Lourdes, and some of the other famous apparitions in the past 100 years, La Salette, that none of them would talk about a physical body that you could physically touch with your physical body. So this is a perception going on in kind of a mystical state, right? In order to have that experience, you have to have your mind in an altered state that comes about by a gift of grace, and then the person can experience the presence of Mary in that special way. All right, so I think that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about Mary, right? In my own experience of Jesus, it was somewhat similar because I do mention this in the book that on December 28th, 1984, I was on my first visit to this city, Isernia, here in Italy, to request ordination from the bishop, Ettore di Filippo, who was a very good friend of mine and with whom I had worked for several years in New York City when he had been at the United Nations. And so, after a very meaningful day, demanding day of meeting people around here, I knelt down in the chapel and was praying in the evening. And I had this experience of I saw really the man of the shroud. I mean, the image that we all see of the face on the shroud coming out of the tabernacle where the Eucharist is kept in a kind of violet light, kind of violet gold light, and spoke to me, and in uh, a very subtle communication. There were words, but it was a beautiful communication of someone who cared deeply about me, and there was a tone of concern in the voice, I will also say, because whoever that was could see the many challenges I was going to face. He said, "If you wish, you can come here. If you wish, you can come here." Okay. So, that experience also was an experience of a being whose body had been transformed into light. All right. And that also goes with what we know of the shroud. So, other people have spoken of other kinds of visions lately because, this is the year 2026, and it's the 800th anniversary of the death of St. Francis of Assisi, who's my patron saint, right? So I can't wait to get up to Assisi sometime this year, maybe even more than once, to pay my respects at the Great Basilica. I like to go up there anyway. I have many friends in Assisi, and it's a great center of interreligious and ecumenical dialogue as well. So um, after his death, there are numerous accounts of miracles that he performed, and he often appeared to people in a kind of body of light. In fact, at the time of his death, it is reported that his body, which had been really racked with pain, disease, he was in terrible shape when he died. Immediately after his death, his body became flexible. The skin became luminous and soft, like that of a child, which is exactly what's reported for Kenpo Acha, okay, and other people. It's kind of amazing, right? So, but not only does the body undergo this transformation, there's also a visionary experience of a cloud, a luminous cloud going up into the heavens, which the early Franciscans thought might be the soul of St. Francis ascending into glory. But it is interesting that in the stories about Kenpo Acha, there is mention of a luminous cloud that was seen at a great distance over the place of his death. Okay,
Yeah.
so getting some more of bits of the
This is
picture.
like, regardless of the culture and beliefs, the reality of the same kind of visuals, it's just different ways of experiencing and visualizing the same thing.
Really. It was
Yeah.
pretty amazing. And so we started digging deeper and deeper and finding things out about his life. We managed to obtain his biography. In fact, I would have to say, without trying to, go into a kind of a hagiographical mode, although we already are there in a way talking about visions and miracles, but um, it was almost as if we were guided because the whole journey. I had allotted 10 days to do the interviews, and it was very difficult to get a driver. I had arranged everything the previous year with a driver and a guide and all of that. Because in China you have to have certain criteria, and I had a very good, but it turned out for various reasons which are not uh, do not pertain to this interview, that was not possible. And we ended up with a very, very difficult, recalcitrant, reluctant driver. All right. So, but in spite of that, in 8 days, we covered all the ground. We covered all the ground to meet the people, to have interviews, to have some time with people and spend time with people. And so actually we were very, very blessed. And when we came back to the town that was our um, kind of stopping off point, Kanza in eastern Tibet, there was a huge rainbow across from
Wow.
one horizon to the other, as if to say, well, we're really glad you did this, and it was pretty amazing because I don't think I've often seen a rainbow that was literally, half the sky like that. It
Wow.
was a really unusual rainbow. So anyway, so we did feel many times guided. I could tell many stories about, our clumsy attempts at doing things and how those were set to rights in a mysterious way, and how the limits of certain conversations also illustrated the values and principles that we were dealing with. So, in a very short time, we came to understand how the Kenpo had brought together different positions, different religious opinions on different sides of different arguments, and that he was able to navigate that world, and others, were willing to stay on their side of the line, and others on their side of the line. Okay, but he was a bridge. All right. And going back to St. Francis, of course, it was interesting that these appearances that are reported for him involve miracles. All right. He would go to where somebody was crying out for help. All right. And we have also other instances of this kind. Take, for example, Saint Romuald, the founder of the Camaldolese Benedictines, who is said after his death to have appeared to his early hermit disciples. All right. And Peter Celestine, who was also from around here, who became the famous Pope Celestine V, who eventually resigned the papacy after about 5 months. He, at the time of his death in 1296, radiated a ray of light from his body that went up into the heavens. All right. So, and then some of the great women saints also quite remarkable. If you have ever heard of Veronica Giuliani, for example, who was a Capuchin nun in central Italy. She left an incorrupt body after she died, and she also took a piece of paper and with a pen drew a heart on that piece of paper. And she then drew the instruments of the passion and death of Jesus
Wow.
on that heart. And she said, when I die and you open up my chest, because in those days, 17th century, they very frequently removed the heart of a saintly person and mummified it,
Mm.
and it would be like a relic, And so she said, when you open up my heart, these are the things you will see. And when she died and they opened up her heart, there they were,
No
you know
way.
pretty
Wow.
amazing. And of course there are many instances of these incorrupt saints as well. Claire Montefalco is one. Of course, Bernadette, Saint Bernadette, who I guess they made is it a film or a play about Bernadette now? Yeah,
I'm not
so
sure. I'll look into it.
she's
Yeah.
actually not only incorrupt but flexible, I understand. And so is Catherine Labouré, the woman who was given the miraculous medal in 1830. So, there's some pretty amazing instances of incorruption down through the centuries. There are two, as far as I can tell, two Christian instances of saints whose bodies disappeared after death.
Hmm.
One of them is a fellow named Simeon, who deliberately, Simeon, the Holy Fool, he's called. And I don't know if you know, but in the Eastern Christian churches, there's a great devotion to these eccentric, almost, you almost say tantric saints. They were eccentric. They deliberately courted contempt. Their behavior was almost like a cynical philosopher. They attracted contempt. They attracted humiliating circumstances. They wanted to show that they were the lowest of the lowly, in order to show their special union with Christ in his passion. Okay, so Simeon was one of these, but he was no fool in that sense. He was also quite brilliant, and there was a Jewish man who became a Christian thanks to his conversations with this holy fool. And after the holy fool died, no one even wanted to bury him. His body ended up tossed in a corner of the cemetery, where it would just start decaying, everyone thought. But the Jewish fellow went to the local deacon of the parish and said, listen, this guy was a saint. He shouldn't be just tossed in a corner. Let's go over there and give him a proper burial. So the deacon said, okay, if you say so, we'll do it. They went there. They couldn't find the body. It was gone. It was gone. And of course, there were miracles and all that. And the other was a monk named the Abba Dula, who I believe lived in somewhere in Palestine. And his story is told by a reputable Byzantine biographer. And after his death, also his body disappeared. And so we do have these accounts, and I think some of them were reflecting people like the Holy Fool or like this particular Abba that practiced very intensive solitary meditative prayer in dark caves for long periods of time, which is something that also gives us a hint of some connections with the dark retreat practices that we know about from Dzogchen masters and also some other schools in Tibet that do that practice.
Hmm.
So
Very
it's
interesting.
out there.
Two things I wanted to mention. One was, we know in science that our mitochondria in our body glow. I think it's like the illumin of a candle lit 15 miles away from where we stand. If we could see it, that's about how bright it glows. But I can imagine, since we're all energy and movements of atoms and protons and neutrons, that could expand out in any kind of way if we knew how to do it, or if the great creator has made it happen.
So, this is what's so fascinating about this research. And in fact, I published an article in 2018, which is available on academia.edu, called Taking the Next Step in Rainbow Body Research, in which I talk about some of the things you just said. I didn't know about the melatonin and the pineal gland, but I did know about the biophotons.
Hmm.
Uh, so what we're doing now is we're moving from our anthropological and historical studies into the scientific possibilities, okay? And we do know that there is a report of an experiment done around 1997 on a Sufi teacher in Germany who, while reciting the 99 names of Allah, which is the Muslim rosary, was able to increase the magnitude of emanation of biophotons in his body by 100,000 times. Okay, so it does seem possible using contemplative methods to enhance biophoton emission. All right, that's one thing. Then we have a lot of articles studying light phenomena among people who do a lot of Buddhist meditation practice. Okay, so they will, be meditating, and then you get light phenomena which might be outside you, or you might have them inside you. This kind of thing. If you close your eyes, you see this mysterious light, which might indeed be coming from the pineal gland. I don't know. That has to be verified. But certainly there are the light phenomena that have been studied. And then the biophoton phenomenon has been known since the 1920s. All living things, while they are alive, emanate biophotons. Okay. And there is at least some evidence that biophotons have something to do, as you said, with the mitochondria and with the chain of command in the cell from the nucleus to the messenger RNA to creating the RNA on which protein synthesis takes place at the mitochondria. Okay, so the whole respiratory cycle is in some ways governed or activated by these biophotons. Okay, so now we have to ask ourselves the question, well, uh, if you can enhance the production or the emanation of biophotons in a living organism, can that also change the structure of the cells? All right, does that bring about a change? And that we don't know yet. We have to do experiments. We have to
Yeah.
find out about that. But in theory, at least,
Fascinating.
it could be possible to emanate light to an extremely intense level. And so it would seem that some of the people we're talking about receive that gift as in the course of their life of prayer.
Mm,
And because it always seems to be connected with being in a higher state of consciousness,
right.
you know. And in the case of Jesus, we would say because of his divinity, right? That there was his divinity manifesting. It already manifested at the transfiguration, and then in the tomb, there was this explosion. By the way, I just was celebrating Mass. I had the wonderful privilege of being able to celebrate Mass at the site of the tomb of Jesus only a
Oh,
couple of weeks ago in Jerusalem. And boy, was that intense. It
I'll
was
bet.
pretty, yeah, yeah. We
Oh
spent
my
the whole
God.
night in prayer and vigil in the Holy Sepulchre. And then I went down at 5:30 in the morning and celebrated Eucharist in the tomb itself.
Ah, that's tremendous. Lucky, lucky, lucky.
That was a blessing.
Oh my goodness. There is light language in the scriptures, correct? What does that signify in the scriptures? Is it signifying something similar to what we're discussing?
Yes. In thy light we shall see light, right? And one
Right.
of, is it Psalm 35, I think. And that's the motto of Columbia University, where I got my doctorate in Numen Videbimus Lumen. And that is very often interpreted to mean that the Torah is the light of Israel. Okay.
Mm,
And then there's Psalm 26. The Lord is my light and my salvation. But there, see, it's saying the Lord. It's not saying the Torah. It's not saying your law is my light
mm.
and my salvation. It's saying the Lord is my light and my salvation. And seek his face. Now think about that for a moment. And think about how many times in the Bible there's this very interesting interplay between seek the face of the Lord and those who see the face of the Lord will die.
Okay.
You know, I mean, people remember the elders of Israel were really afraid when Moses invited them into the presence of God and they might see God, and but they saw God and lived. When they came out of that experience, they could still eat and drink, it says. All right, but remember that Moses' face was glowing, and there were rays of light, which has been translated as horns, because the
Mm,
word in Hebrew for those rays of life is also similar to the word for a horn. There's a horn-shaped ray of light coming out of his face. All right, and so that he had to put a veil on his face when he spoke to the Israelites because his luminous face was so fearsome, looking. All right. So there's this light that is transmitted from the presence of God to the prophet. Okay. And so that's kind of interesting too, because it's not only the Torah, it's not only a metaphor, there is something mysterious
mm,
described as happening. Okay. So I think that this takes us, of course, to the Transfiguration. There's Elijah, who was taken up into heaven, and Moses, who had this luminous quality on his face, and they're there with Jesus before Peter, James, and John on the Mount of the Transfiguration, and Jesus's body becomes white like snow, brilliant white. And they say, then he's talking with Moses and Elijah about the prophecies of his own suffering and death. And then the voice of God is heard. This is my beloved son. All right, hear him. All right, so the apostles are knocked out. They're in this altered state of consciousness. Oh, this is wonderful to be here. Let's put up three tents, so that we can always be here. And of course, that doesn't happen because they have to come down from the mountain and continue the mission. But it's a moment in which you might say the light bulb gets turned on and they are ready, all right, for what's about to happen, which they don't understand. Right? The Gospels are not very gentle with the apostles when it comes to their level of understanding what Jesus is trying to tell them.
Right.
They're having a very hard time breaking with a merely human way of reading things and an obsession with politics. All right, let's face it. They want the Romans out of Israel, and they can't get past that thought. And Jesus keeps telling them it's not going to happen like that. but but anyway, they are given this gift, three of them anyway. So that after at the time of the crucifixion and then afterwards, they'll understand even more about what's about to happen for real. Okay. So I'll have to say this, that for a Catholic Christian and really for any Christian, the idea of the death and resurrection of Jesus is absolutely central to Christian faith. It's called the Paschal Mystery, meaning the sum total of everything that Jesus came in his mission to do for humanity. All right, and it's the way it is brought about. It's not only something, oh, isn't that nice? Jesus did that wonderful thing. It's not distant. It's so immediate that it is the risen body of Christ that we receive in the Eucharist.
Mm,
That's why the Eucharist is so important for us in the old growth Christian churches. It's so central because that is the body of the risen Christ made in a form that we can eat. All right, the bread and the wine, but it is fully that risen body given to us as a sacrament. All right, why? To accompany us on this incredibly difficult journey. And we're really having a difficult time right now, as you
well,
know, in the
we
world
are
today.
certainly having a difficult time.
Anxiety, I mean, talk of a
Uh,
war, talk of violence, talk of, all kinds,
Tribalism, yeah.
and
Um,
divisiveness everywhere. You can't open your mouth and somebody won't say something against what you just said, even though you thought you said it with the most pure of intentions.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, it's quite something. And I mean, when I was in Jerusalem a couple of weeks ago, you can't help but feel that uh, the holy city and the lands around it are almost like a focal point in which all of this is played out in an even more intense way.
Mm.
The differences and conflicts among Christian denominations, for example, the conflict between different categories of Jews, different categories of Palestinians, different kinds of Muslims, different kinds of other groups in that area. It's all an area of great tension, requiring the greatest tact to go from one meeting to another, from one encounter to another, one moment of prayer to another. All right, right there in the Holy Sepulchre. Well, I was saying morning prayer with my companion, and we were told to shut up by someone on the other side of that area because we were bothering her prayers. Okay. So she came quite violently into our faces and hollered at us, We're in the holiest place of Christianity. And during the night, there was a shouting match right by the tomb of Jesus itself between two different groups who I don't know what they were arguing about, but they were using very strong language and very loud. Okay. So, and then I went visited my Jewish friends who work with Palestinians. Then I went to visit my Palestinian activist friends who you could hardly talk to them. They were so angry. And then, talking to people more on the side of Israel, and then going to try to sort out all the facts. And boy, is that a challenge, let me tell you. So, you can just imagine that the Holy Land is like a mirror of the world we're in. So, to talk about these things and to present the book and the ideas and the research may sound to somebody like, we're living in Never Never Land, but in reality, what I'm trying to do with this is to illustrate an honest search, not just for facts, but also for the meaning of these things. And one of the most important things in the book is because I couldn't even figure out how to write this book, in all honesty,
Right.
right? Around 2010, I was so overwhelmed with the implications of what I was doing that I was really like writer's block. And a couple of friends of mine said, "Come on, Francis, you can do it. You can do it." And then I finally clicked on a narrative when I realized that underneath the story of the rainbow body was another story. And that was the history of the exchange of ideas
Mm.
among people across the great mass of Asia, right?
Right.
The Silk Road and the exchange of ideas, religious dialogue, and the challenges that people faced as they encountered one another. And I discovered the Chinese Christian texts, which I already knew about, but I discovered some really remarkable things about those Chinese Christian texts. And also, I began to analyze some very rare fragments that have been found at Dunhuang and Turfan, these oases in the great deserts of Central Asia, and that show us that there really was contact between Christians and Buddhists
Mm.
in the 8th century AD.
Wow.
Okay. And so now we have a story because just at the very same time that Tibet is becoming fully Buddhist, right, that the Buddhist evangelization of Tibet is taking place, the Christians and the Buddhists in China are having a lively conversation, and the Tibetans in Dunhuang are meeting Christians. And I'll tell you some amazing things that I found that were found there that
Please.
actually writing in Tibetan about Jesus, the Messiah.
Wow.
Okay. This is incredible. So all of a sudden we have a story here. We have a story of an exchange of ideas. And so this means that Tibetans knew about Jesus ascending into heaven. They knew of the resurrection. They knew that he was the hero of these Eastern Christians who were present in China at the time. And, something started to percolate.
Mm.
Maybe something started to percolate. But then what really clinched it for me was when you get to the 11th century and the Tibetans are having their own internal religious culture war, okay, between the old and the new schools that are operating in Tibet to bring about a full Buddhist civilization in Tibet, all right, but building on pre-existing beliefs, the Bonpos. And what you begin to discover is that one of the founding figures of early Buddhism in Tibet, right, was a fellow named Vimala Mitra. Okay, and Vimala Mitra is considered one of the first to become a monk, one of the first translators, one of the first writers in Tibetan about Buddhist teachings. In the collection of writings ascribed to his lineage, there is a biography of a fellow named Garab Dorje. And Garab Dorje is believed to be the founder of Dzogchen, right? The human manifestation of the Dzogchen teachings. Well, this is really fantastic because if you read that biography, it sounds strangely familiar. Okay.
And
And
for
so
clarification for our listeners who may not know, Dzogchen is like the apex of Buddhism, right? I mean, it's seen
yeah,
to be the highest development of Buddhism.
right. It's considered
Okay.
the ninth vehicle, the highest vehicle, the great completion, the great
Hmm.
perfection, all
Great
of that.
perspective.
Not all of the schools agree with that, but that certainly is the claim. All
Okay.
right. And the reason is that because it essentially drives us to look at each of our thoughts, all right, with the eye of enlightenment. All
Mm,
right. In that way, thoughts and distractions, emotions and passions, and everything that happens to us from moment to moment spontaneously dissolves into pure awareness. Okay,
mm.
pure consciousness. Okay, that's just in a nutshell. But what's amazing about the life of Gana Dorje is that, and I'm not the first to notice this, but I'm the first to like sit down and really hack away at it. Is that it sounds like the story of Jesus and Mary.
Hmm.
But Jesus and Mary where? Not in the Gospel of Luke exactly, but in the Quran of all
Huh.
places, in the 19th surah of the Quran. So here we are in Ramadan. All of our Muslim listens go to Surah 19, and there's a story of Miriam and her miraculously conceiving. She's in retreat in a grass hut. All right. And she receives a mysterious luminous visitor who is the angel Gabriel, who tells her that she's going to conceive. She conceives that she's very embarrassed about this conception because she's in retreat. She's trying to be pure, and all of a sudden she's pregnant. And then the Quran says, well, she has to do some explaining to her relatives who are quite upset with her and all of that. But the child is born, and so on and so forth. So the core story is that. But then in the Tibetan version, it's a princess who seems to be living near what we would call the Aral Sea. You know the Aral Sea, it's to the east of the Caspian Sea, and it's that very sad story of a beautiful primordial lake in Central Asia that under the Soviets was polluted and drained almost into non-existence. But to the south of that is a land known as Khwarezmia. And Khwarezmia may be the homeland of the Indo-European people, the people who go east and west with the languages that we all know, right? Sanskrit, Russian, Latin, Greek, and so on. All right. So this is a key place in the human universe, right? The human story. And there a princess conceives and bears a child whom she rejects because he's an embarrassment to her. She's in retreat in a grass hut. She wants to be pure and a great attainer of enlightenment, but here she is mysteriously pregnant thanks to a visit from a luminous angel being who comes and tells her about this. She throws the baby into an ash heap in disgust, in horror, and the baby, instead of dying, rises up.
Huh.
And all kinds of miraculous things start to happen. And this baby turns out to be Garab Dorje, the person who was gifted with the insights about Buddhism that lead to the emergence of Dzogchen, of the Great Perfection. There are a lot of details in my book about that story, connecting it point by point with the Quran, but also with other elements of Eastern Christianity, which show that whoever wrote that story in Tibetan knew the story of Jesus and Mary, both in the Quran and perhaps in other sources. All right, confirming what we see in Dunhuang with the little story about Jesus rising into the heavens and being the friend of mankind. Quote, just like Buddha Shakyamuni and Vajrapani. Get that. Talk about syncretism. There we are. All right, so this is a pretty amazing time in human history, that 8th century where ideas are being exchanged very freely and widely across Asia. Interestingly enough, going back to the Shroud, we can find, and they have found, coins across the Silk Route that have the gold Byzantine solidos, I think it's called, have the image of Jesus on them. But which image is it? It's the face on the shroud.
Oh boy,
Is that cool or what?
that is super cool.
Okay. I'll never
Weren't
forget the
there, if you can correct me, I think I heard that there were some earlier Byzantine accounts of religious things that happened that are seemingly borrowed into the Bible, just like you're saying the Dzogchen with Mary. Is that true as well? I mean, it seems like there's just universal stories that
Wow.
happen,
You
and
really
I'm
get
wondering if people are just borrowing from each other to give credence to their spectacular being, or is this the way God or Jabril or whomever says, this is how we do it? We'll do one here. We'll set, like you set up a franchise. You follow the playbook. You get someone away in a small building. They're private and quiet. We get them pregnant without intercourse. They have a child who comes up and is amazing. I mean, this just could be the playbook, or is it borrowed stories?
All right. Well, you probably know from having read the book that there's a whole section on narratives and how they work. And
Right.
so, and a lot of people have read the book and don't get that. And I really wish that I'm glad that you brought it up because it seems to me to be a very important piece in the puzzle. Because now we can understand something about the way of life of people that we as modern Westerners know almost nothing about. All right. So here we say, how do people exchange ideas? How is it that humanity over millennia, remembers things about history and genealogy and all of that? Now, people have told us that, for example, the Polynesian people have a fantastic memory for genealogy, and that's been verified, and a lot of information has been gleaned from those studies. But let's think for a moment about something really pretty extravagant, okay? I'll start with one thing, all right, and then we'll go to the really big stuff. All right. Go to the early Buddhist canon written in Pali, probably in the 1st century AD. Go to the sutra called the Agannata Sutta. Okay. Agannata Sutta. All right. This is the story of the origins. All right. So there you have human beings made of light who move around by just thinking about where they want to go. They are very pure. They're they're asexual. They're up there floating around and they do whatever they like, and one of them makes a boo-boo. He eats something sweet that he found on the ground. What does the sweet stuff on the ground sound like?
Hmm.
In the Exodus, right? He eats the manna and he starts getting a little heavy, right? Before you know it, he's a male. And then others do it, they become female. And before you know it, they're having sexual relations. Before you know it, all kinds of things start happening. Not only that, but the manna stops flowing.
Hmm.
Start eating rice. At first, the rice is abundant, springs up of its own accord, or you don't even have to cook it to eat it, and it's absolutely delicious. They start stealing it from one another, and all of a sudden it doesn't grow spontaneously anymore. They also have the story of if they gather it and keep it for the next day, it rots. What
Hmm.
does that remind us of? If you keep the manna till the next day, it will rot. And they found maggots in it, remember, in the book of Exodus. So the story of the origins in the Buddhist canon has lots of little pieces, little fragments broken pieces of glass, you might say, that correspond to what we have in the book of Exodus? Or is it the other way around? And that the story of Exodus somehow was written by people who knew an earlier version of that creation story, going from luminosity down to carnality and struggle and conflict. It seems to be a universal myth, all
Right.
right, and something that tells people about our own story. Go again to Exodus. All right, we're thinking about the Middle East a lot these days, right? How do you get from Africa to Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia? You have to cross Sinai. You have to cross into what we call the Holy Land. So all of these people from mostly from East Africa are going up through and crossing the territory that we know about so well from Exodus, right? And in fact, the whole human race, all right, expanded from that land bridge all the way into Arabia, India, Southeast Asia, and around to China, Central Asia, and into Europe. Because only much later, or probably after the Neanderthal period, do we get transportation across the Mediterranean.
Hmm.
Most of the time, people had to go through the Sinai. So the Exodus story is not just about the 12 tribes descending from Jacob, but it's the story of humanity as a whole,
It
right?
is.
And so, as a story, it's a wonderful story of a people. It's become a sacred story. But as a story that connects the dots on a lot of things that have happened hundreds of thousands of years before the days of Moses, it's an amazing example of the legacy of storytelling in the human adventure.
Mm.
It's almost like stories are part of a mysterious DNA, our consciousness, right? That there's a consciousness DNA as well as a biological DNA that we carry with us.
I believe
There
that.
are
Mm.
really some amazing things that could be told about this, but my theories about narratives, I think, are borne out by people like Christopher, oh, what's his last name? Uh, the author of the book on history of Tibetan Empire in
Mm.
Central Asia. It'll come to me. Anyway, in there he outlines the heroic story of Central Asia, the
Mm.
first story, right? And it's again the child miraculously born, thrown out of the home, persecuted, raised by animals, all right? Then comes back, heroic, gathers a band of warriors, conquers the kingdom, imposes justice on the unjust, and then builds an empire and a civilization, right? This story, this wonderful story, which is like a signpost. It tells us, where people come from, where they're going, what life is like, how to overcome adversity, and all of
Well,
that, and keeps repeating itself over and over again.
right.
Powerful.
It's almost like that's our map of how to become a man, or how to and succeed. It's we're children, we have to leave the home, whether it's of our own accord or we're kicked out for bad behavior and too much slacking or whatever. So much adversity over our lives, right? And we have to pull ourselves up, and then we can build a business, build a life, build a family. Doesn't have to be an empire, right? But the metaphor of that is really teaching us, um, how to be a human, really, man or woman. Um,
And
Very
as a
interesting.
child, I remember being fascinated by the stories of knights. You
Yeah, me
know,
too.
I couldn't wait to get
The
myself.
hero's journey.
I
Yeah.
wanted a horse.
I wanted
It's
the
like,
sword.
and the swords. Oh, I made swords,
Yeah,
lots of
yeah,
swords,
yeah, yeah,
and bows and arrows.
yeah.
Because my grandfather was a carpenter, so I had plenty of things
Oh,
to play with. And I
nice.
mean, just as much a part of my DNA as anything else. So
Right.
there you go.
That was.
So this is an important part of the book because it shows how East and West connected. So in other words, you don't have to find, oh, um, let's say Vimala Mitra, for example. Vimala Mitra met with thus and so Christian monk, and they had a conversation. And Vimala Mitra said, "Oh, that's really cool. I like this idea of the resurrection. I'm going to invent a yoga technique to do the same thing." It's not that blunt.
Right,
That's
right.
telling the story with a blunt instrument. However, interesting story. There really was a Christian monk named Jing who really did work with a Buddhist monk in China in the 780s. And thanks to the Japanese, especially, we know a lot about this Buddhist monk named Prajna, who came from where? Balk.
Yeah.
Where's Balk? Afghanistan. Afghanistan. And at that time, what language were they talking in Afghanistan? Well, some early form of Farsi, but also Aramaic. Aramaic. Jing is a priest. Actually, he was like a Monsignor in the Church of the East in China, in the capital. And what language do they use in that church?
Don't say Aramaic.
Yes, Syriac.
Seriously.
Syriac, which is the Christian form of
Yeah,
Aramaic.
that's
So
crazy.
he and Prajna would meet up, and Prajna would say, well, I've studied in India, I've studied in Sri Lanka, I come from a Buddhist monastery in your home territory out there in the West. Let's talk Aramaic. And they do. And he says, I need to learn Chinese, because now I want to translate all these texts I brought with me. And Jing said, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So he teaches them Chinese, and they translate a sutra. Now, according to some scholars, they will say this bold act on the part of a Buddhist monk and a Christian monk, right, to translate a Buddhist sutra was criticized to the throne, to the emperor
Oh,
of the Tang Dynasty, and they were told not to do that anymore. Now, I've been doing a lot of reading about that problem. I think that that is actually a later interpretation of what actually happened.
mm,
In the Japanese accounts of who Prajna was, he was the guru of Kobodaishi, the founder of the Shingon school in Japan.
hmm.
So Prajna is a big saint for the Shingon school, and they have a quote from him in which he says, "I came from they say it's translated Kashmir, but it's the Chinese word Hu, which doesn't mean Kashmir; it means Afghanistan. All
Mm.
right, I'm a Hu, and I came to China and I taught Kobodaishi, and I translated the Gandavyuha Sutra and this Shat Paramita Sutra. All right. He was proud of it. He was proud that he translated that sutra with Jing. And then he was made head of the translation bureau. So if he had made a mess of the translation of the shorter sutra, why is it that they went on and allowed him to translate even more and also esoteric texts as well, Vajrayana
Right.
texts? If he was a boob, if he and Jing just screwed everything up, they didn't. All right. He became one of the greatest translators of the Chinese Buddhist canon,
Mm,
which means Jing was really a pro when it came to Tang Dynasty Chinese.
yeah.
All right. And he himself wrote a brilliant book called the Book of Mysterious and Wonderful Blessedness. All right. In which Jesus, now get this, is depicted as teaching St. Peter, his principal disciple, the real meaning of the Buddhist terminology that Christians were encountering in China. Is that cool or what?
That is super cool.
All right.
Oh my goodness. I'm reading that
That's
book
in the
now. I've
book
got to
too,
get
with
it.
complete translation and commentary on that. All right.
Wow.
Which is an amazing text, actually, because if you know, we're beginning to know a lot more about the Syriac speaking Christians and the mystical traditions that they preserved from the ancient Middle East, Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. And they had it. They had an amazing collection of experiences of light, and they write about it in detail.
Wow.
So, here we go. It's not only the teaching about the resurrection, it's not only the coin with the shroud image on it, it's inner experience that they knew about and they wrote about and could tell the story.
That's
Right?
incredible.
Yeah.
That's incredible. I wanted to ask, we're going to get back to that in a minute too, but I wanted to ask before I forget um, about other unusual bodily phenomenon in Catholic mysticism. I think of Padre Pio, and we have a big church and property up here for Padre Pio that I visit, and his astigmatism and his healing abilities. I mean, they're quite amazing. And also, I was thinking of Saint Faustina.
Oh yeah,
Faustina, right?
yeah,
Uh, Kowalska, did I say that right? If you
yeah.
can maybe comment a little bit on those two.
Yeah, well, Padre Pio in some ways almost replicates the life of Saint Francis in many ways, right? And during his life, he was able to bilocate. He was able to be in two places at once,
Yeah,
and people report that he came to me when I was dying or when I was sick or whatever. There's that episode with the boy in London. There
yeah.
was an episode with a woman, I think it's either Argentina or Paraguay. And then there are many stories around here in southern Italy where he's, very, very deeply loved to the present day. He died in 1968. All right. He also received the gift of the stigmata in two episodes, which he describes to his spiritual fathers in letters that were written, I think one in 1910 and another 10 years later. Okay. The first one was when he was hearing confessions, and there were the young seminarians coming to him for confession. So they're on one side of the grill and he's on the other side, so they can't see him. But he's having this visionary experience, and some mysterious figure with a flaming lance penetrates the rib cage with this mystical object. And so he receives the wound on the side, right, in that first episode. And then in another experience in 1918, he experienced the wounds in the hands and the feet. And they remained with him continuously until he died in 1968. All right. And they were many times studied and examined. Is this a fraud? Is he injuring himself? And all this was shown to be completely false, that it was a mystical phenomenon, a paranormal phenomenon, and, it was verified many times. To this day, people will say, if you go to the shrine of Padre Pio, sometimes he appears. I had one fellow tell me, um, I went to confession. I knelt down and I suddenly realized that the priest in the confessional was Padre Pio. And this is long after his death. I confessed to him, he absolved me. I came out of the confessional to kneel down to say my penance, a few prayers. I looked over, there was no confessional there. There was nothing there.
Nothing. Nothing. Oh my goodness.
Talking about amazing stuff. And you hear stories like this all the time. Uh, I'll tell you a little story of my own. You know, I don't usually say these things, but
I bring the best out of people
we
in
got
the
to mess up.
conversation.
So I had an erotic dream one night. All right. And it was the night before we were going on pilgrimage as priests to the to the shrine of Padre Pio. And so I'm there. I didn't commit any sins or anything. It just was this awful erotic dream, which I really wanted to forget about. So I get to the shrine, and there are these mosaics on the wall, and there's a an image of a pillow with a demon inside it. All right, that looked an awful lot like what I had just dreamt about. You know, so I turned to a priest friend of mine and I said, "That's amazing. Look at that. I just dreamt that myself." And I'm looking at this picture, which is evidently an episode in the life of Padre Pio when he too was tempted by an erotic dream and it took this form. And so I said, let me go to confession right away and receive absolution. But it was really so incredibly inspiring because it was like you think that I'm just a story that somebody made up. Well, I gave you a dream and now you've seen the picture. So we're on the same wavelength. You and I, we're in this together. It was a beautiful experience. And I think I should also say that when I was for a while one of the exorcists in our diocese,
Mm.
that I actually learned the practice of exorcism from one of Padre Pio's direct disciples,
Wow.
Father Cipriano di Meo, who was a spectacular person, somebody that I wouldn't doubt someday will be canonized. But he was really something. And Padre Pio gave him the authority, like transmitted his power to him, just
Mm.
like Elijah to Elisha, to have the power to do exorcisms. And a very, very impressive individual for decades, like from 1953 until he died, and I think 2008, he was the exorcist of Southern Italy, the go-to guy,
Yeah.
amazing person. And so I learned from him. So I do have that connection with, even though I'm not a Franciscan except by my name, but
Right.
those Franciscans, those great, great priests, really great men.
Wow. I'd like to insert something and get your opinion. We were talking about bilocation, right? And we talked about the light body, and we talked about Jesus in the Chinese texts or explaining the Buddhist thing and the Silk Road. And
Mhm.
there's quite a bit of stories about Jesus in India and these missing years. But in the Kriya Yoga tradition, which Yogananda made popular in his book Autobiography of a Yogi, but in other books, a lot of the Kriyas believe that Jesus was a Kriya Yogi, and they have his picture in with the whole lineage of the Kriya masters. And in Kriya Yoga, one of the siddhas or skills that they teach, these phenomenal skills, is bilocation. And so I'm wondering if you have ever verified or read accounts of these things kind of coming together.
Yeah, I know about this devotion to Jesus in the Kriya lineage. In just outside of Assisi, there is a center called the Ananda Europa Center for Kriya Yoga,
Hmm.
uh, and a number of friends of ours are actually part of that community. So I know about it. I uh, I don't know enough about Kriya Yoga. I read, of course, in Tibetan Buddhism, Kriya Tantra, all right, is a ritualistic form of Tantra, very much focused on purification. All right. So that's one of the things that I do know about. I don't know as much about Kriya Yoga as a yoga practice, but I think it's related to Hatha Yoga and again, purification practices through Hatha Yoga, breath control, and probably cleansing the body, if I'm not
Hmm.
mistaken. If I know what I do know of Hatha Yoga, which I was initiated into Hatha Yoga by the great Swami Satchidananda back in 1970, who was a
Wow.
buddy of Brother David. Okay,
I
so
think I have 10 of his books, Satchidananda's books. I love them. Yeah.
but I could tell stories about him too. He was pretty extraordinary. But
Yeah.
anyway, so that's what I know of Hatha Yoga is mostly,
Mm.
asana, pranayama, and some of the purification practices. And many of those practices were taken up into Tibetan Tantra as well. But whether Jesus was a Kriya Yogan, I don't know. I will tell you my honest opinion about these ideas about Jesus in India, and I have to be a little critical. All right, because I have illustrated by what I've just said that there were contacts between Christians and Buddhists and probably other peoples, Zoroastrians, Manichaeans, Hindus, and
Mm.
others through Central Asia and actually in India. We have the presence of a Christian church in South India, maybe as long ago as the first century, if the St. Thomas legends are true. But certainly by the fourth century, there really was a Christian church in South India. All right. And so India knew about Jesus in one way or another. They knew there were these people, and they were considered actually of the warrior caste, and they were highly regarded by some of the kings in South India, especially Kerala, Tamil Nadu, that area. Okay, so about Jesus and about a church, yes. Jesus himself, I don't think so. I'll tell you why. Let's quickly dismiss the burial site in Kashmir. This is a pious Sufi devotion deriving from a Sufi master writing a beautiful devotional poem in the 18th century.
Mm.
All right. This is a long time after Jesus. Okay.
Yeah.
And it became, as many times happens in India and other places. You build a shrine to commemorate a holy person, and suddenly it becomes the thing. You know, like in Washington, D.C., there is a copy of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, and people go there on pilgrimage, right? To gain some of the graces that you gain by going to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. But it's not in Jerusalem, it's in Washington, D.C. I love that place, but it's not the same thing, right? But it's a good place to pray. You know, similarly, we have that kind of thing. But let's go a little farther. Jesus taught his disciples things that go back to our Jesus seminar friends who don't really believe in the doctrinal stuff, but they do study the quotations. They do study in detail the earliest texts that we have. And you don't find that kind of teaching in the early texts that we have, whether it's the letters of St. Paul, which are older than the Gospels in all probability, the four Gospels that we know so well, the apocryphal and Gnostic Gospels that come a little later. All of that material has a lot of interesting things to say, but there's nothing about pranayama in there.
Right.
And there's nothing about asanas in there.
Mm-hmm.
However, there is one thing that is interesting, which I did find in South India in my research there, taking in the solar light,
Mm.
absorbing the solar light into the heart. This is in the Gnostic treatise on the resurrection, if it is Gnostic, because a lot of these texts, you know, they may have been written by somebody who would be called a Gnostic, but they were used by Orthodox monks.
Mm.
And it says to swallow
Mm.
this light into yourself and
Wow.
attain the resurrection. Okay. So it's in there. And so there is a practice in there. And it is a very beautiful and interesting practice. In Tamil Nadu, I learned that the great Valalar, who lived in the 19th century, Ramalinga, attained the light body by doing the practice going back to the 8th century of Mula Valar, excuse me, Mula, no, Tirumular, yeah, right. Tiru means glorious, Mular means the root, right? The root guru of that time who taught, imagine the solar light coming into your heart and hold it there with the sound Om, Om.
Mm.
And then allow it to spread through your body and cause the conflagration in every cell of your body. Okay. So this practice going back to, again, 8th century, right, was the method of awakening the light body. All right. But this method we do not actually find in the New Testament, but Jesus evidently had it because he shows it in the Transfiguration and the Resurrection. Now, in the New Testament, we do have in I think the first or second letter of Peter, a reference to a light that arises like the dawn in your heart.
Mm.
Okay. And that seems to be a hint of something,
Yeah.
because that is what starts to happen when you meditate and pray. So, you know, in a serious way over a long period of time. The Syriac fathers report a light that appears within, but also in front of you. And it's kind of circular and kind of sapphire colored. And Evagrius of Pontus, who is my go-to guy for Desert Father spirituality, talks about the sapphire light also,
Oh.
referring to the floor tiles, the translucent floor tiles under the throne of God in the book of Exodus. Okay, so it's sapphire color, like the sky, of course. All right, so you see this sapphire light when you're beginning to enter into deep communion with God, when you're beginning to see the face of God. All right, so these are actual mystical experiences that they're reporting about. And then one of the authors that I've read, have been translated from Aramaic, says it then transforms into a crystal. And then through that crystal, you can have a vision of the Trinity itself. Okay, it was pretty amazing.
Wow.
All right. And so, and you know that crystal is very important in yoga and also in great perfection practice. Okay, it's painted on the walls in the Lukang Temple in Lhasa. That they hold up this crystal. So all of these things are extremely interesting that they are, even if they were discovered separately, they seem to point to the same human reality
Yeah.
and the spiritual aspiration, which is pretty important, I think. So I don't think that we see in Jesus's teaching the kind of thing that we would have seen in India of his time.
Mm.
For example, Tibet at that time was probably mostly a fairly kind of in a way a little bit like Old Testament Judaism, animal sacrifices, temples, deities of thunder and the mountains, animal forms on which the deities would ride.
Hmm.
Okay, all right, all of that was present in Tibet in the first century. We know that from some of the research and by archaeologists like John Belezza, and some of the other people that have done that work. But we don't have great perfection. We don't have Buddhism. We don't have any of that in the Tibetan plateau, as far as we know, in the first century. In Kashmir, there was Buddhism, and Gandhara and all of that in the northwest part of India, what is now Pakistan. But that kind of Buddhism was very much Mahayana, scholastic, philosophical, meditation focused. It was not the same kind of thing that we have like in later tantric Buddhism, you know. And if Jesus had gone there, he would have been intrigued, I'm sure, with the debates going on, may have even engaged in them, but he didn't bring back with him that information
Mm.
if he did go. And I
Yeah.
don't think he went. I think he had enough to do with the Essenes, to tell you the truth, right
Yeah.
down the road from him. I mean, the Essenes were exploring all kinds of things, and so there we probably have the real school, if we want to look for a school, at which Jesus could study.
Right.
That's, of course, how did he get to be called a rabbi anyway? Because he doesn't ever mention a teacher.
Hmm. Right.
Who was his rabbinic guru? We really don't know. There was probably a rabbi up in Nazareth, you know, but in Nazareth they had their doubts about him, you know,
Right.
maybe because he was hanging around with people like the Essenes, we don't know. But in any case, he breaks out of the eggshell of the Essenes and their intransigence, their dislike of the temple, their criticism of the priests in the temple, but also their belief in an ultimate apocalyptic war.
Mm.
And Jesus starts talking about love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. Blessed are the persecuted, blessed are the meek, which is totally different from the Essene teachings. And even John the Baptist, who almost certainly was connected to the Essenes in one way or another, he is upset and he sends his disciples to Jesus and said, what's going on? What is all this? And Jesus says, you see what's going on? All these miracles? Are you getting the point? Getting it? And it's interesting that there is this tension.
Yeah.
Iraq, now down to less than 10,000 people, there are the Mandeans who continue to say that John the Baptist was the Messiah and Jesus was not.
Hmm.
Continuing this
Interesting.
polemic, that that the Messiah was supposed to preach a war against the evildoers and not all this meekness and forgiveness. And they do baptism in the Euphrates and all of that. But it's interesting that when a group of them came to Rome to talk to the Pope, they insisted on having their own department. They said
Wow.
he said we don't want to be interreligious and we don't want to be ecumenical. We want to be like the Jews, and a
Hmm.
separate, special office for us. We're the
Wow.
Manichaeans, the followers of John the Baptist. So there are still these things going on in the world. And it's amazing how they survived,
Yeah.
centuries, centuries, but they did. But there was
Hmm.
this disagreement in style between John the Baptist and Jesus.
You obviously have a deep love for Christianity, the Bible, religion. Your whole life is in this field and in this belief system. And when I think of that, I just don't know other priests who have an interest in Buddhism so deeply as you do, right? It's like separate religion. Buddha said there's no God, right? above, but yet you have this deep interest in Tibetan Buddhism specifically. And how was that accepted within the church, and by your peers or your teachers? And what made you then want to look at the rainbow body as a serious uh, as a serious study that would be taken seriously? And multi-part question, but
Mm.
you know,
Yeah, well, the many people have this idea that somehow the church would come down on people who were doing investigations into unknown territory or unusual territory. But we also know that there is a history of exchange between Christians and Buddhists that goes back, as I said, to the 8th century at least. All right, in China and then also Japan, and then the whole history of the missions and the great figure of Ippolito Desideri, who was a Jesuit at the beginning of the 1700s. He went to Tibet. He had a passion for going to Tibet and
mm,
proclaiming the gospel. So he went there. His companion could not deal with it. There were previous Jesuits who had tried and had spent some time in Tibet. He made it to Lhasa, and he made friends with some of the great Gelugpa lamas. He got to meet some of the leadership in Tibet at that time, including the Mongol warriors who were kind of the the strong arm of the government, at that time. Now, this is the end of it's after the great fifth Dalai Lama established the Tibetan state as we know it in the 1640s. So this is 60 years later, 60 or 70 years later. So he was the first Westerner to figure out who was the historical Buddha, all right,
mm,
to figure out the chronology, to figure out the philosophy. He translated great works out of Tibetan into Latin, believe it or not, and wrote about Christianity in Tibetan.
huh,
All right. And at the same time, there were Capuchin friars in Lhasa. They didn't always get along, but they did, work on a dictionary and an approach to the a Christian approach to the people there. So, in my personal history, among other things, of course, it's my spiritual father, who was a Benedictine monk, who asked me to do this research. All right, so in a certain
oh,
sense, it was part of the great monastic tradition of obedience to the spiritual father that I did that. All right. And the second thing is, of course, that when I came back, and I mean, I already had a doctorate in Buddhist studies from Columbia University. My spiritual directors along the way had always encouraged this work,
hmm,
uh, especially two other Benedictine monks who were very high level within the Benedictine order in Rome. And then, all right, so I actually taught about Tibetan Buddhism and about the religions of Central Asia at the Gregorian University in Rome for about 4 or 5 years.
oh,
So, I introduced all this material, in places where these are very sensitive topics, and yet my work was accepted. I even gave a public lecture on this book at the Gregorian University in Rome. So they know that Francis is up to stuff and
right.
has interesting things to say. And I'm glad of that. And I have never had any opposition or obstacles of an official kind
Mm,
over the years. In fact, I don't know if
just,
you remember, but in my biography, I was for 5 years the person chosen to be responsible for interreligious dialogue for the entire United States by the Catholic Bishops' Conference in Washington, D.C.
yeah.
So, I did dialogue with Islam, with Buddhism, with Hinduism. I created the Sikh dialogue. We did a lot of work in those years, and even with Jews and some of the Protestant groups also, I was asked to guide some of the dialogues. So I had a very wonderful experience of 5 years in
Yeah,
Washington. That.
that.
So you could say that this is part of my life, and I think the church has respected it, on the whole. I am now responsible for dialogue and cooperation with the Muslim communities of the Abruzzo and the Molise here in Italy, right? I mean, officially working for the
Wow.
bishops to do that. So, so there's a lot of personal story and a lot of personal investment. My interest in Tibetan Buddhism actually goes back to 1970, because soon after I met Brother David, I began reading, inspired by a very interesting fellow who used to hang out with us undergraduates at a coffee house on the Cornell campus in upstate New York. Uh, his name was Rick, and he used to say, you really have to read the Evans Wentz translations of the Tibetan teachings. You know these
Yeah.
probably.
Yeah. I've read
Familiar
Evan Wentz. Yeah. Evans Wentz.
Yoga and Secret Doctrines, the Book of the Great Liberation, and the Tibetan Book of the Dead, all of
Yeah.
that. And it was mind-blowing. These are extremely interesting works, even though we know the translations are flawed and whatnot, but it really gives you a sense of a really great world-class culture that evolved in Tibet thanks to the introduction of Buddhism. All right. So very powerful part of my story. Later, I translated biographies of Milarepa and worked on the teachings about the life after death and the experiences after death. And I worked, of course, on the rainbow body and related topics, and have been in touch with a lot of lamas over the years, who have been my teachers and with whom I have an ongoing dialogue and a relationship of deep trust, to the point that I will go to Kathmandu. I was just there last June, the previous year, doing translation work and getting advice from lamas on how to translate some of these difficult texts into good English. And so there I had a page with me last summer, complete gibberish. I could not understand what, this was getting at, all of these really strange words. And so I took it to a Lama that I know, very good man, very learned scholar. And he explained to me point by point that these were like abbreviated sentences describing initiation practices. In other words, the
Mm.
master wants to show the disciple what something is like before it happens. All right. And so they have this vocabulary that's very specialized for
Cliff
that.
Notes.
Cliff,
Cliff Notes.
right. Right. And it really does have to be explained orally by the teacher because you would never understand it just by the words that are on the page. All right. It was so beautiful to be able to do that. So that
Wow.
also is part of the story here. The anthropological study and the text study. Very important.
Wow. So we spoke about the rainbow body in Tibet and your experiences researching with it in recent times earlier in the conversation. Would you please re-describe for us what is meant by the rainbow body in Tibetan Buddhism?
Okay. So in the first place, we have to narrow the field. There are really only two schools of thought or orders, religious orders in Tibet that believe in and teach methods related to the rainbow body. That is the Nyingma, the early Buddhist practitioners from the 8th century, going back to Padmasambhava, and the Bonpo. Okay. And the Bonpo are considered a non-Buddhist but Buddhist-like form of religious practice in the history of Tibet. They have some pre-Buddhist elements and some Buddhist-like elements. Okay, so it's a kind of a hybrid tradition, which may have its roots actually in Central Asia. Now, there are a lot of discussions about that. But anyway, the Bonpos do have a great perfection or Dzogchen system, as do the Nyingma. And it's in the Dzogchen world, Bonpo and Nyingma, that you find the teachings on the rainbow body. All right, what is the rainbow body? All right, at the time of death, someone who has been practicing the relevant yogas and meditation practices of the school that we're talking about may manifest various signs just before and after death. One of the typical signs is the shrinkage of the body or even its disappearance. In some accounts, hair and nails are the only thing left. In other accounts, you'll get a miniaturized body, or as in the case of Khenpo Acha, there's nothing left. Okay. But it's a disappearance or a dissolution or a shrinkage phenomenon when you're talking about the body. There are also other phenomena, light, rainbows, music, perfumes, all kinds of paranormal phenomena that go on around the process of the dissolution of the body. In the case of Khenpo Acha, there were all of these signs around the hermitage where he used to live and do his meditation. Okay. So his disciples were there for that, the 8 days that it took for the body to disappear. The body was kept under a cloth so that it could not be directly seen. All right. In some instances, people have zipped themselves into a tent or enclosed themselves into a cave for that final process. But even outside the cave or the tent, there were rainbows and other manifestations.
Mm.
So the disciples know that something significant is going on. One of the characteristics of a rainbow body attainer is that immediately after death, the quality of the face changes. The face becomes luminous, the skin becomes like that of a child. All right. And other changes begin to occur, indicating that a transformation is taking place, a physical transformation. Okay.
Hmm.
An account during our interviews with one of the leading Bonpo teachers, Yongzi Rinpoche, also known as Lopon Tenzin Namdak, who just passed away last June 12th. And he told us back in 2003 all the detail he could possibly get on dark retreat, on the teachings, on the yogas. He gave us 10 days of teachings on the rainbow body in the Bonpo Dzogchen tradition. And while he's giving these teachings, he gets a phone call on his cell phone. Somebody is experiencing dissolution of the body at that very moment in Tibet.
Yes.
Amazing, huh?
Crazy.
And it all goes awry. The authorities are called in and they tell the family no photos, no videos, cremation right now. All right. Sounds like a disaster. Sounds like a great disappointment. But actually, from the point of view of communicating with skeptical, Westerners, shall we say, or materialists in any nationality, when it doesn't go right, what does it tell you? Something was happening, something was going on that had to be suppressed. Enough was going on that it was persuasive.
Right.
All right. So I take that particular moment as particularly auspicious in developing a credible, a plausible argument about this whole thing, that really something does occur. Now, that's the Dzogchen thing that we could talk about, the two stages called Trekcho and Toga and all of that. But I do want to make a comment about another phenomenon, which is called Tukdam. And Tukdam is not restricted to the Dzogchen schools, but is well known, for example, even in the Gelugpa school of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other traditions in Tibet. What happens? The At the time of death, the monk, who's usually a very advanced and elderly practitioner, remains in meditation posture, ceases breathing, but around the area of the heart, there is a palpable warmth.
Hmm.
And the body may remain in meditation posture, flexible and vertical for 3 days to as long as 3 weeks without any sign of decomposition.
Hmm.
When Tukdam ceases, the body collapses over, and then the usual procedures for preparing for cremation are followed. But it's that period of time in which the monk, the yogi, is abiding in a particular state of contemplative union with Buddha nature, all right, that is being manifested in that way. All right. So, and you can see that also this indicates that uh, deep and prolonged meditation practice does bring about a different way of living and dying. All right.
Mm.
Altered traits that are observable.
Right. So altered traits, not states, because it's a changed observable phenomena that's occurred.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Hmm.
This has been studied by Richard Davidson's lab
Hmm.
a number of years now. They've been collecting data on that.
Okay. And I wonder if we go back to um, thinking about resurrection in Catholicism and rainbow body in Buddhism, in Tibetan Buddhism. Um, does one emphasize grace and the other realization, or is that kind of nitpicking things? Like if the Buddhists don't believe in God, is there grace, or does it not matter if they believe in God because God will do what God will do? You know, so
That's a very important question, which
yeah,
a lot of my friends, we just talked about this for years. Um, all right, let's think about it in some constructive ways. In the first place, let us be willing to be at least flexible about what Buddhists say about themselves. All right, and learn to hear what they're saying and also to understand the context. All right, so I don't want to be overly harsh on Western Buddhism, but we know that some of the schools of Buddhism that have come to the West have adapted themselves, as it would be inevitable in any religion, to the needs, preferences, and prejudices of the people that they're addressing. Okay. So, for example, the question, is Buddhism a religion or a philosophy, would never arise in the Asian cultures in which Buddhism is the prevalent religion,
mm,
right? Because Buddhism is a way of salvation. It's a
right,
way to liberation. It is a way that involves prayer, asceticism, mystical practices, meditation practices, obedience to a teacher, following a monastic rule, and so many other things that are characteristic of a complete religious system and way of life. Okay.
mm,
In the West, of course, we're individualists, so we have an approach that would be interested in what does a person need to do to get a rainbow body, but
right,
it's a
right,
perspective, you don't get a rainbow body, you don't. In fact, even the word attainment, I read a very nice comment by a Theravada monk who said, "There's no attainment; it's what you're getting rid of." You're
right.
wanting to get rid of stuff, all right?
That's
And
correct. Yeah, yeah.
in a way, that's what we're talking about here too. It's a getting rid of the excess baggage of conceptualization, rigid thinking, ways of misusing the body and the mind, unwholesome practices and habits, and getting just dropping all of that and becoming more and more free and more even in a certain sense beyond the conditioning mechanisms that define us as individuals, as bodies, and so on. Okay, it's a very profound analysis of the human condition, respectful of the human condition as the frame within which enlightenment can take place, but also aware of the fact that what we think we are has to change radically. All right, and that's the salvation, the soteriological insight of Buddhism. Okay, so the attainment of the rainbow body has to be in some way in profound relationship to that insight. All right, so that the dissolution of the material body, all right, is also linked to a universal kind of compassion, wanting to be present for everyone in a mysterious way. And in
Mm,
fact, Acha did manifest to disciples in various ways after his death. All right, so that there are stories of him helping, guiding, prodding, encouraging disciples after his death, and of course, our own experience of feeling guided. So there is that. So we're always talking about real human communities where a life is led in a certain way. Okay. So in that sense, the relationship between, let's say, old growth Christianity, like Catholic, Orthodox, Eastern Christian, Coptic, and so on, or all these old growth churches have a way of life. They have a language, they have a liturgy, they
right.
have a style, they have a hierarchy, they have monastic communities. They have traditions of prayer and practice for lay people as well as monks and all that, sacraments and so on. So it's a whole way of life, a whole way of guidance. There's a moral teaching, and then there's a way of interpreting the scriptures. So it's all in that kind of package. All right. That's why we get the impression sometimes, like you said earlier, right? Oh, this religion is over here and that religion is over there. And of course, we've challenged the the idea of an impermeable package
Right.
by talking about narratives and the journey across the Silk Route. But we also know that there really was a Byzantine culture. There was a medieval Latin Catholic culture. There was an Indian Buddhist culture, a Chinese, a Japanese, Korean, and so on. And so we know that there were distinct cultures built out of the fundamental insights of these great religions. So when we ask ourselves, what's the transcendental cause?
Right.
At that point, you simply have to open yourself up to what's my faith?
Yeah.
What's my
Yeah.
faith? If Christ is teaching us about the kingdom of God and showing the way in not only moral teachings, but in the way he lived and died, right? And hinting to us to awaken to a kind of discipleship in which we become like him. All right, that he's going to empower and enable that transformation. Excuse me. So a lot of people, are kind of this is a little bit like I have to say, reading the diaries of Sister Faustina. She was obviously a very holy woman, but she suffered terribly because I think that the spiritual guidance she was getting was putting her into a very awkward situation.
Mm.
She's working with young women who were in trouble. That was the job of her order. She's having all these mystical experiences. She's getting guidance from various confessors, and she's trying to break through to a loving relationship with Christ. But she has imposed on her relationship with Christ a separation.
Mm.
Jesus is over there, and I'm over here, and I'm nothing. He is everything. He's calling the shots, and he's always, almost always out there. Sometimes he does come into her heart. Sometimes he does. Uh, and that's when she begins to show signs of profound transformation. But
Mm.
it's this out there stuff, praying to a Jesus who's out there, rather than allowing Jesus to come into us, not I who live, but Christ living in me. St. Paul, letter to the
Right.
Galatians. All right. So the tendency to change Jesus from a proclaimer and savior who shows us the way to the kingdom of God and becoming one with him, right? One with him, not just like him, not imitating him only, but becoming one with him, is impeded by a kind of worship of a kind of statue like Jesus, kind of an idol. All right.
Mhm.
And so Sor Faustina, really, I think, suffered a lot because I think instinctively she knew the real path,
Yeah.
but her cultural context blocked it, you know?
Yeah.
So it's interesting that Padre Pio had some of the same problems, but he overcame them. And of course, the stigmata were a way that Christ himself stepped in and showed him how to be another Christ. And Sor Faustina reports invisible stigmata as
Mm.
well. So she was moving in that direction. She's always moving. That's one of the beautiful things about St. Faustina. She was, in spite of the incredible suffering and horrendous circumstances, I mean, she's living in Poland on the cusp of the Second World War, and
Oh.
she can't help feeling, being a mystic, she can't help feeling that terrible danger is just around the corner, and she dies before the dam bursts. I mean, it's a very dramatic story in a way. But she illustrates also some of the problems in Catholic spirituality. I'm now working on another book. uh,
Nice.
called Discerning Stirrings, a personal experience of Catholic spirituality.
Oh,
And I do
wonderful.
take Padre Pio and Saint Faustina um, in this book as illustrative of the struggles of Catholic mystics to come to a deeper understanding of their relationship with Christ and how Christ is always guiding us from within.
Hmm.
On the cross, has that wonderful verse, badly translated, but in that poem on the Dark Night, he says, "He kept my heart for himself intact."
Hmm.
He kept my heart for himself. The Spanish reflexive pronouns, conserva se, this kind of thing. It's so beautiful and so badly translated. But that's what he meant, that Christ is always working within me, even when I've lost it. He's there. This profound trust in Christ's operating force within us. And that is what I think would characterize Catholic or really ideal, universal Christian spirituality is the deep trust that Christ is transforming our lives from within and teaching us lessons that maybe we don't want to learn, but we
That's
learn
right.
it.
That's
We learn
right. So if we take the acculturation out of it and some of the language of divine versus, we could say that what Christ attained and Buddha nature, Christ consciousness are parallel, and it's just different cultures speaking about ways to attain that. And I think if we included maybe like Advaita Vedanta and look at people like Ramana Maharshi and others who have, annihilate the ego. Who is the I? Who am I? And there was one and no second is some of the Vedanta things that it's all pointing to the same exact thing, you know.
This is where, of course, if you say that to a dogmatic theologian, they get all upset.
Oh, of
You,
course.
when Bede Griffiths said that Advaita Vedanta and Dzogchen look like the same thing to me,
Right,
right?
right, right.
And he was into Advaita Vedanta. He was a Ramana Maharshi,
Hmm.
as well as being a Christian mystic. And so uh, people get upset because of the words,
Yes, right.
form of the words, and the aesthetic of the words. Okay,
Correct.
see, so that's another good reason to look at the flow of language and culture across, the great expanses of human experience. And notice that at the edges, there's always a kind of blending.
Hmm.
Languages tend to blend at the edges. I mean, I remember my first trip to Europe. We got off the train at this unbelievable town called Modane on the French border of Italy, okay, near Genoa, I guess. And everybody there speaks a really weird language. That's a mixture of French and Italian. Right. So I had learned French in school and I knew a little Italian, so I could kind of understand them. But I said, I wonder how anybody else can understand these people. But
Right.
it's on the border. So there's going to be this language. And when you think about the relationship between, even though they're fighting with each other, but Orthodox Christians, Armenian Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, Druze, Alawites, different kinds of Jews, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and others as well, different kinds of Hasidim. They're all there and they're all trying to hold an identity. One of my Palestinian friends told me years ago, well, Father Francis, don't you know religion is all about keeping people separate? you know,
Right.
and yet,
In
and
that
yet,
way. In that
and
way.
yet, the very same passion that animates Palestinian Christians animates Jews, animates
Right.
Muslims,
Right.
right? And many of the same words, especially when they're all talking Arabic, or Hebrew, which is not that far from Arabic, or Aramaic, which is again part of the family, right? There's a blending at the edges, even of the most contested terrain. All
Yeah.
right. You could go to India and you could go through that process dozens of times from one region to another, and you'll see that. So that it's a mosaic with very fuzzy edges, around the tesserae. you know. There's a lot going on out there with
Right.
an exchange of ideas and beliefs. But the trick here is now you're referring to the great mystics who, when they try to speak language about what they have experienced,
How to explain the unexplainable, right?
unexplainable, right? They inevitably go toward metaphors that
Right.
pop up time and again, time and again. And even when they want to make distinctions and theological clarifications, still those metaphors really do hold center stage. The rivers flowing into the sea one,
Right.
thing, or the flame that consumes but doesn't, but actually the flame that burns but doesn't
Doesn't
consume,
consume. Yeah.
or the iron, that's in the flame and it turns bright red, right? So that you can hardly see it anymore. It's one with the flame. I mean, all these metaphors are used repeatedly in the great traditions to describe the ineffable. And the beauty is when you run into somebody who's actually had such an experience, or
Right.
is even living it, all the time. That is what you want. All right.
Yes.
That's what you really want. You know.
So we aspire to those things, and I mean, I think we should all aspire to those things. I'm not saying everybody does, because we want to become elevated, right? We want to reach the Christ consciousness, the Buddha nature, the one with no separation. And when we identify with things, I'm Catholic, I'm Christian, I'm Muslim, well, I'm Sufi Muslim, all these, I'm Mahayana, well, I'm Dzogchen, well, that identification is just a play of the ego, which is there to separate and keep us separate. I mean, that's my belief on that part. And a lot of that realization, I think, is the dissolution of the ego, because you are not separate from that which is animating and have created you. I mean, you know. So we know in Vedanta and Buddhism that meditation is a core practice of embodiment, of trying and attempting to reach these higher states. Are there practices in Christianity, broadly speaking, Christian mysticism that because a lot of priests that I see or churches, it's just about a hymn, a psalm, a story, go home. I don't really see, you know what I'm saying? It's kind of like, all right, we've done our duty for the week or the day, and now I'm going to go back to being an ego person separate from everything. You know, but within the church, are there practices that, like meditation or others, that would help you attain these higher states?
Of course, it's easy to say yes, and it's easy to describe the practices that are fairly well known. I think the rosary, the Ignatian kind of meditation on passages of scripture, the uh, various kinds of contemplative prayer that are being taught. I mean, even psalmody and hymn singing is not to be sniffed at. I mean, they're
Yes,
pretty,
yes.
I love doing that stuff.
I didn't mean to be flippant about it. Right.
But I mean, in addition to feeding ego and being easily victimized by
Right.
ego drives, every religious system is also a container within which there is safety and security because, as you
Yes.
undoubtedly know, a lot of people go crazy doing spiritual practices the wrong way or in an exaggerated way. They break away from their teacher. They try to do it on their own. They read
Hmm.
a book and they think they've got it figured out. And of course, a lot of people have come to my door, having made that mistake and need help. So we know that a container is not only helpful, it's really necessary. All right. Then there has to be a wise person who at
Yes.
least is well along on the path, who is handing on the tradition. All right. That's really important. So that maybe not quite a saint, but at least someone who has had inner experience and knows when's the right time to do that, when's the right time to stop doing that, and move on to that. Okay. Also, it's really important. How many times do we run into this in a mystic like Ramana Maharshi, or in Mahayana Buddhism, or in Eckhart, or any of the great Christian mystics. In a certain sense, it's something that's already there that needs to be discovered, uncovered, rather than something that has to be attained by grasping.
Right.
Okay. Brother David was so good at this in his teachings over the years. The attitude of gratitude, the attitude of an openness to the world and what's going on, to people and what's going on, and then the capacity in the midst of even the most terrible challenges of life to have true gratefulness, to understand that these relationships that we're having, all right, are diminishing our egos and opening us up to a process that's going on from within. All right. And in fact,
Yeah.
the whole idea that what we call God, the divine, Buddha nature, pure consciousness, whatever you want to call it, is a presence within the human person, and it is one of the greatest things that there is about being human. All right. And one of
Hmm.
the beautiful things about it is you can discover it through a life lived in the container of a particular tradition, but you can also find times in which, on your own, in silence and solitude, applying what you've learned in your community, you can discover it within yourself in silence, right? So that it has this beautiful quality. It isn't only found in the container, but you learn in the container, in your church, in your mosque, in your temple. You learn the principles. You meet good people. You meet those who have walked the path. And then you can go into your solitude and ask yourself the question, like, who am I?
Right.
What is this? Right? And then settle into silence and allow the silence to transform you. Right? That it is, in a certain sense, there is a dynamic quality, a sculptor working on us from within. All right. That is really a very important and almost universal discovery
Yeah.
of the mystics, right? That I didn't do really anything. I don't deserve this. Why am I being given these amazing gifts, right? Well, not because of, your ego, but because you are human and some reality, someone, I would say, loves you loves you deeply and wants to allow something to unfold in you that perhaps you keep getting in the way, but little by little it starts to come out.
Hmm.
I mean, even when you talk about Buddha nature, even if you believe that Buddha nature is not a permanent reality separate from your embodiment, but is a moment by moment phenomenon, right?
Beautiful.
That arises and arises and arises. Even if you believe that, it's still something that is within the stream of consciousness that little by little, if you allow it,
Right.
becomes the prevailing state of consciousness. Okay.
Hmm.
And that's enlightenment. That's it.
Exactly. Exactly. How we look at the resurrection or the rainbow body um, change our relationship to death in practical terms?
Hmm. Yeah, one of the things, of course, a generation of us is now, the famous baby boomers, right? Or infamous. I guess now
Mhm.
we've infamous. All right, we're approaching, our 70s and 80s and whatever, and will inevitably die. There are people who are trying to prolong their lives. There are people trying to become immortal and all of that. But we know that most of us really will die. So, as I'm working on this book, of course, I'm dealing with a person, Kenpo Acha, who lived a really exemplary life. He had a good relationship with his disciples, male and female. He lived his vows. He was respected as a really good monk. He did the rituals, he did the yoga practices, he received teachings from great masters of different lineages. He made peace with animals. He made peace with bandits. He survived the communist invasion of Eastern Tibet. All right. He, was an exemplary person. Now, he died at 82. Somebody might say, oh, 82, that's not so old, How come this guy was so, powerful and could practically, work miracles and, be in two places at once? Because there are episodes of that. How come he didn't live to be 120 or something like that? And you see, this shows how we have turned death into a measuring stick for something. We don't even know what it is. In the book, I talk a lot about this problem. Use the Italian expression che fine ha fatto, and you go like this with your hand, che fine ha fatto, right? Whatever became of so and so. You know, we knew he was good for nothing,
Right.
and look at how he died. Isn't that disgusting? That kind of right. But what a horrible way to look at other people. What a horrible way to
Yeah.
measure a life. And who's going to measure you when you say that, when you do that? What have you done with your life? All right. And here's where death really comes in with a message, because it comes in to say it is possible that you could die a beautiful death. And that death could be a message for the people left behind. It could be a message about simply having been a good person, someone who maybe will be forgotten 5 years, 10 years, 100 years. But maybe for a couple of years after you go, people will say, hey, Joe was a really good guy. You could go to him with a problem and he was all for you. He was there. He was a caring person. Didn't work any miracles. He didn't appear in anybody's dreams. His body didn't shrink when he died, but he was remembered, cherished, all right, appreciated, not just condolences and, oh, it's so sad to see him go, but really remembering a good person. What does that do to us? It's almost like what happens to a baby when they're placed on their mother's breast for the first time. There's an exchange that goes on almost really on a chemical level of life giving. So that kind of a death is life giving. That kind of a death helps us live. So when you have an extraordinary death, the mistake would be to put that on a pedestal and say, wow, what a great guy. This is so fantastic. I wish I could be like that. But rather to look at it as saying, this is really so great. It's putting in high relief not just the value of Kenpo Acha or even the high value of his lineage, but what it is to be a human being. What an incredible thing it is to be a human being and to even know about stuff like that and to allow yourself to be touched by a fact like that. And then finally also to die with a unique dignity as a person who, with paranormal signs or without, will be remembered for a while as someone whose, you might say, blood and hormones and breath and hands did something, that stayed with me. And I think we can think of relatives, people that we cared about that were like that, and they stay with us. I have some buddies who've died. I mean, a lot of my friends have died before 75. I'm 75 now. Kind of unnerving. But I can remember what they said and their jokes. And a lot of times their jokes stick with me and their
Yeah.
expression. And I think about them. Oh yeah, yeah, you're here, right? You're with me. That is the kind of loving friendship, humanity that we're talking about here. And it's a wonderful manifestation of the continuity of life that goes on after death, right? In the memory and in the life of other people. We keep thinking of ourselves as boxed in individuals, right? And we're not. We're not. We're connected. And even that whole idea, ego diminishment, boundary diminishment, the illusion of separateness, all of that starts to go away when you know a person like that and you start to act even spontaneously like that. good place to be.
Wonderful place to be, and a really great place that we can close this conversation for now. And I just want to say thank you very much, Father Francis Tiso, um, for the generosity of your time and your teachings and your storytelling, and for your really well done books and research. We really appreciate them. I thank you
Thanks.
so much.
All right. Well, greetings to everybody. This is Lent. This is
Yes,
Ramadan. This is Tibetan New Year's, a time really to, you know, catch up on our virtues. All right. So let's do it.
sounds great. Thank
All right.
you.